Are we ready to begin, Mr. Registrar?
Yes, Council, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Rob Senta. I will be leading the evidence today, and I am pleased to present Mr. Chris Murray. Has Mr. Murray already been sworn?
I will swear him now. Good morning, Mr. Murray. I'm just going to ask you to affirm your evidence, so please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you give in these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray. As I said, my name is Rob Senta. I'll be asking you some questions today on behalf of the Red Hill Valley Parkway Inquiry. After that, counsel for the participants and including counsel for the City of Hamilton may also have some questions for you. Hopefully the technology works, but if at any point you can't hear me or can't see me, please signal and let us know, and we will try and fix that for you right away. In addition, I have a number of monitors in front of me and my eyes may be darting around as I'm trying to find the next document. So please understand that I'm not looking at you. I'm just trying to figure out where we're going next.
Not a problem.
Okay, you can hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Great. Mr. Murray, since 2018, I understand that you have been the city manager for the City of Toronto.
That's correct.
And before that, you worked at the City of Hamilton.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions about the positions that you held at the City of Hamilton. I understand you worked there from 1995 to around 2018.
Correct.
From 1995 to 2002, you were an environmental planner in the Special Projects Office.
That's correct.
From July 2002 to June 15th, 2007, you were the acting director of the Red Hill Valley Project.
Yes, acting project director, correct.
And then you left that position, you became the director of housing at the City of Hamilton. You held that position until January 1st, 2009.
Correct.
And from 2009 to August 13th, 2018, you were the city manager for the City of Hamilton.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some questions about your time as the acting director of the Red Hill Valley Project, which spanned, as we just mentioned, from 2002 to June 15th of 2007. And I note in the documents you are frequently referred to as the acting director of the Red Hill Valley Project. Why acting?
It's a great question. There was, I don't think, a decision made by upper management to change the title, and nor did it concern me.
Okay. Did it matter in any way for your day-to-day functioning in the role?
Mr. Santa, no.
As acting director of the Red Hill Valley Project, you reported to Peter Crockett, the general manager of transportation, operations, and environment?
Initially, yes, and then later to Scott Stewart.
Okay. Registrar, if you could please call up HAM 58525. And Mr. Murray, we see here a org chart as of November 2002. And at that time, it shows that you were one of the director reports to Peter Crockett, who is then the general manager. And that accords with what you just told me.
That's correct.
If I could ask that document, HAM 58525, be marked as the next exhibit. Mr. Murray, the Red Hill Valley Project had a long history.
Let's just make sure we've got the registrar on board, and he can tell us all what the number is, so we don't get lost in this.
Noted, Council. It should be Exhibit 34.
Thank you.
Mr. Murray, the Red Hill project had a long history that predated your involvement as acting director of the project.
That's correct.
Did you have any involvement with the design or the construction of the Lincoln Alexander Parkway?
No.
If I could ask registrar to call up HAM 31690. Mr. Murray, this is a project update that you provided to the mayor and members of the council in September of 2002, I guess. Actually, I'm not sure what that date rec. This would have been a 2002 project update.
So,
You know-
Mr. Santa, yes, it's definitely 2002, but whether it was September or February, I'm not entirely sure.
That's fine. Is this a document that you prepared for the members of council?
That's correct.
Registrar, could we go to image 5 of this document? On image 5, we see a fairly lengthy history of the Red Hill Valley project that indicates at the first bullet that the planning goes all the way back to the 1950s. And is that an accurate description of at broad strokes, the history of the project?
That's correct.
Now, as project director, you had a number of people working with you. Registrar, if I could ask you to please pull up HAM 58527. And if we could just zoom, thank you. And this is an organizational chart dated February 19th, 2004, and shows that you had a number of people reporting to you, including on the far left side, Gary Moore, the manager of design, and reporting to him, Marco Odie, senior project manager.
That's correct.
Does this accord with your recollection of at least the direct reports to you in the Red Hill Valley project as of February 19th, 2004?
That's correct.
Registrar, if I could have that document marked as the next exhibit, please.
Noted, council. So exhibit 35.
Thank you.
Can I just ask? It's not normally my role to get involved in these technical details, Mr. Santa, but should the previous document, the one which set out the history on page 5, should that also be treated as an exhibit?
That document is already included in an overview document, so it already forms part of the evidence of the inquiry commissioner.
Good, thank you. Okay.
And I think that, just to foreshadow, I think that will be the case for all but one of the remaining documents. All of them are already appear in an overview document.
Good, okay.
Registrar, if I could have you call up overview document 3, page 10. And at paragraph 17, Mr. Murray describes that the first version of the project charter was dated March 25, 2003, and it sets out a number of the roles and responsibilities for the members of the team. And if I could ask you, Registrar, to please turn to the next image, image 11, and call out the text under 8.2 Project Director. Mr. Murray, did this description of your role as project director accurately describe your role in practice?
Could I get you to shrink that just a little bit, Mr. Senta? It's, there we go. Thank you. Generally, yes.
Is there anything that you would add to make it a more complete or accurate description of your role on the project?
It appears to me to be consistent with document 1010100, or sorry, 10101. I'm just trying to compare this information to the information of the project charter dated February 2003. So the wording looks pretty much similar. So I don't know if I have anything else to add to it.
Okay. Would you prefer if we pulled up that document, or does it matter for broad strokes? Roughly, it's a fair enough description of what you were doing.
It's fair enough.
Okay. You yourself are not an engineer.
That is correct.
What skills and experiences did you bring to your role as project director?
My background, as pointed out at the very outset of this session, is that of environmental planner. So my background is urban planning, specifically related to environmental planning, and therefore a background in environmental assessment, which this project, as you noted in its history, has gone through provincial EA and then was subject to federal EA. So I have reasonable knowledge about environmental planning overall as it's carried out, certainly in this province at that time. And so I was very familiar with the project itself in terms of all the diverse skills that are necessary to complete a project like this, including engagement with stakeholders in the community, et cetera. So I had a broad understanding prior to taking this role. And so certainly that and other experience that I had before joining the city of Hamilton and its predecessor, the region of Hamilton Wentworth.
Just to reassure you, Mr. Murray, the text that we've called out in the overview document, pages 10 and 11, is reproduced from HAM 10101. So it's the same text, just in a different format.
Thanks, Mr. Senton.
Thank you, Registrar. If I could ask you to now call out the text under paragraph 8.3.1, Gary Moore. And again, if you could size it for Mr. Murray, like the last text box. Thank you. Mr. Moore, in practice, was this an accurate description of Mr. Moore's role on the Red Hill Valley project?
I'm assuming here, Mr. Senta, that it's taken from the same document we just talked about.
Yes.
So it's, I would agree, it captures his responsibility.
Is there anything you would add to make this description more complete as a more complete description of how it worked on a day-to-day basis.
I think as you had said earlier, from a broad strokes perspective, I think it captured it.
Who made the pavement design and specification decisions for the Red Hill Valley project?
Could you be more specific in terms of the project office or just?
Yeah, who at the city was charged with making those decisions?
I'd rely on Gary for those decisions.
Okay. And did Mr. Moore have to seek your approval for engineering decisions, or did he make them and then relay the information to you?
He would make those decisions and I'd be informed of them. Yes.
Who was responsible for supervising the work of the engineering consultants during the construction of the Red Hill Valley project?
I think it's worthwhile to provide a bit of context here. I mean, there were two individuals within the project office, both professional engineers with considerable experience in roadway design and construction, together with consultants who were hired to assist with design elements, including pavement. So there was a very large group of people and professionals that were assembled to work through the details of this project from a civil engineering standpoint. So there was obviously anything that would be brought to market that would be tendered would be subject to professional engineering standards. So there was certainly, I think, a number of not just internal staff, but external staff or external parties that were heavily involved in arriving at a final design.
Sure. And the external consultants would give advice about various design features. And I think you said in the project office, there were two people responsible. Is that Mr. Moore and Mr. Odie?
That's correct.
And from the city's perspective, then having received the advice from the external consultants, it would be for Mr. Moore and Mr. Odie to receive that advice and to make the decisions on behalf of the city.
That's correct.
Thank you. If we could end that call out box and staying in overview document 3 registrar, if we could move please to image 13. And in paragraph 20, Mr. Moore provided you with a document called a latest version of the preliminary design report. And at pages 14 and 15 of the preliminary design report, there was discussion of the possibility of using SMA for the Red Hill Valley Parkway surface layer. And can you read the indented text below paragraph 20, or would you like us to call that out for you?
Could you call that out for me?
Sure.
Can I just see the last part?
Sure,
I see.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay.
So this is the preliminary design report that was circulated on February 25th, 2003. Do you remember when you first learned that the city was considering using stone mastic asphalt as the surface course on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I don't remember exactly, no.
Would this have been one of the first times that you had heard about it in this version of the preliminary design report?
The idea of an SMA being used?
Mhm.
I mean, I don't have the, you know,
Okay.
I don't have the recall of exactly what I would have read and remembered in 2003.
If you can situate yourself back in February 2003, would you have known, did you know much more about SMA than what is contained in the preliminary design report?
So there's just some noise outside the room here. Could you repeat that question? Sorry about that.
Of course. If you can situate yourself back in February of 2003, did you know much more about stone mastic asphalt than the text that's set out in the preliminary design report?
No, I would not have known much more than what is in front of us right now.
Do you recall any conversations with Mr. Moore or Mr. Odie about what they saw as the benefits of using stone mastic asphalt?
In 2003?
Yes.
I don't recall.
Okay. There are a number of benefits described in the preliminary design report. In 2003, did you find any of those features particularly attractive in your role?
If I may, just generally, and I can't attribute it to 2003 specifically, but sure. And again, I go back to the history of the project and the efforts that were being made to try and mitigate some of the environmental consequences of the project. And when I say environmental, I don't mean just strictly natural, the socioeconomic, particularly noise. So in reading what we have in front of us here and any discussions that would have taken place potentially then or later, you know, obviously the noise attenuation would be certainly helpful in the overall project and what we're trying to accomplish, along with obviously maintaining a well-designed civil engineering project.
Was one of your roles as project director to talk about the project to citizen groups and homeowners that were near the planned route of the expressway?
Yes, myself and many others.
Okay. And was the noise mitigation from the expressway a topic of concern in those conversations?
Yes.
Are you able to help us pin down the date when the city decided that it would be proceeding to use stone mastic asphalt as the surface course?
There's certainly reference to I think it was an award application for an award in, I believe, in July 2005. And so that where there was a submission being made where there was mention of SMA as the preferred asphalt treatment. And then there was a more direct email, I believe in 2006 from Mr. Moore to myself and others within the organization where it's probably even more declarative in terms of SMA being the preferred asphalt treatment. So
to take it one step at a time, Registrar, if you could first turn up HAM 20576. Mr. Murray, I believe this will be the email regarding the application for the award that you just mentioned in your answer.
Sorry, Council, do you mind just repeating the call out for that?
Sure. HAM 20576. This is an email from Stuart Scott, dated July 21st, 2005. Text is, Michelle, can you print this for Chris and let him know his mailbox is full? The dreaded email that your mailbox is full. And if we could registrar, please turn to image 3.
Sorry, Council, only appears to be 2.
I see. So the attachment is different. Could we please go to HAM 20577?
Sorry, just repeat that for me one more time.
20577. And this is the application for the award. And registrar, if we could please highlight the 5th line of text that starts with pavement type. See there, Mr. Murray, I think that's the reference that you were saying in the award application to the type of pavement that was being used. And right. I think we'll come in a couple of minutes to the email that you were describing, which I think is dated March 7th, 2006. So about 6 or 7, 9 months later, I guess, than after the award application. So without being, and we're coming down to sort of a range of dates in which the decision would have been made that the city would go forward with an SMA surface course for the Red Hill Valley Parkway. From your perspective, regardless of the actual date the decision was made, who made the decision to use an SMA surface course?
Within our office, Gary Moore.
In your role as acting project director on a day-to-day basis, were you reviewing engineering reports or reports, for example, from Golder Associates about design features or the pavement mix, or was that, let me stop there. Did you review those reports in your role?
No.
Okay. If you received any information about those kinds of reports, how did it come to you?
I would rely on Mr. Moore.
Okay. And would he communicate that through email or in meetings or both?
By both, generally.
Okay. Thank you, Registrar. If we could stop that call out and turn, please, to overview document number 3, image 9. In addition to the Red Hill Valley project team, which consisted of city staff, I understand there was also a group called the Expressway Implementation Committee that was later renamed the Parkway Implementation Committee. Is that right?
This is could you just expand on that? This is
sure.
Reference to exactly what, sorry?
So it is my understanding that in 2002, a committee of counselors was established that went by two different names at two different times, either the Expressway Implementation Committee or the Parkway Implementation Committee. And initially, in April of 2002, as set out in paragraph 15 of the overview document, City Council established the Expressway Implementation Committee and appointed 7 councillors initially to sit on that committee. And my first question for you is, do you recall why these councillors from these wards served on the Expressway Implementation Committee?
If you could I just want to look at all the names first.
Sure. Could we call that out? Paragraph 15, please.
So generally speaking, the individuals that are listed here were ones whose wards were either directly or indirectly impacted by the project, the Red Hill Valley project, that is, meaning that it traversed their wards. There are, though, and included here is Larry Deaney, who I believe at the time would have been mayor. But, and then I want to point out that Councillor Braden, whose ward was removed from the immediate project area, was a long time outspoken critic of the project and was part of the committee, I believe, for that reason.
I believe that Councillor Deaney was elected mayor and served as mayor in the 2003 to 2006 term.
Okay.
So I think this would have been just prior to his election as mayor, when he was still serving as councillor for Ward 10. Okay. And from your perspective as the project director for the Red Hill Valley project on the staff side, how did you interact with the Expressway Implementation Committee?
Largely to provide information updates as to now that the project was continuing, to ensure that they were clear on its progression, afforded the project office an opportunity to understand any specific issues or concerns that individuals had based on conversations that were being held with the constituents. So really, more than anything else, it was an effective way to communicate with those, as I say, directly and somewhat indirectly affected by the project.
Did this committee have a decision-making role with respect to the project?
It did not.
Okay. So where decisions needed to be made, those were still made at the standing committee or council level?
That is correct.
What level of detail was provided to the members of the Expressway Implementation Committee around engineering issues and the technical side of the project, as opposed to concerns being raised by the public or other stakeholders who had an interest in the project? Do you recall the balance?
I couldn't tell you what exactly the proportion of engineering related information versus non-engineering would be, but both were communicated.
Registrar, if I could ask you to please end that call out, and staying in overview document 3, please turn to image 21. And if you could call up both image 21 and image 22 at the same time, that would be great. And I think, Mr. Murray, this is the email that you were referring to earlier when I was asking you the questions about pinning down the time that the decision to use SMA was made. This is now January of 2006. And Councillor Braden is raising some questions about the asphalt conditions on the link. And in response, Mr. Murray, on February the 6th, 2006, sorry, Mr. Moore, you copied in Mr. Moore, and Mr. Moore drafted the response that appears as the indented text on image 22. If I could ask the registrar to call out that text. Thank you. First, am I right that this is the email you were thinking about earlier when we were trying to pin down the date of the decision?
Yes.
And it seems that by January of 2006, there's, as you said, a declarative statement. We will be using SMA mix on the north-south expressway surface. You had a chance to review that?
Yeah, I thought I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. Yeah, I was gonna end the call out, but I didn't want to do it while you were still reading.
No, we're good.
Thank you, Registrar. Please end the call out. If I can ask Registrar to please turn up HAM 32478. Mr. Murray, this is a information update to the mayor and members of council from you. Who would have drafted this information update?
As with most of these kinds of documents, I mean, there'd be a variety of people. I don't think you could pin it down to one in particular. So I would suspect this one would have come from various members of the project team.
And you would have played a role in coordinating that input, integrating it, and then editing?
I think that's a fair statement, yeah.
Okay. Registrar, if I ask you to call out the second paragraph that begins paving. Take a moment to read that, Mr. Murray. One general question. This memo is in the form of something called an information update to the mayor and members of council. What is an information update, and does it differ from other kinds of reports that go to council?
This is it is as it's intended. It is an opportunity to ensure that as we had committed to communicating as much as we could, as often as we could, information about the project. This was a, if you will, an informal way of keeping members of council aware of progress that's being made. And so it differs from a formal report that would go to a standing committee and ultimately council that with the powers that do vest in municipalities for them to give direction to staff or to approve direction that is being requested.
Okay. Is one of the differences that an information update does not contain a request for council or a committee to take a particular action?
I believe council would rely on professionals within the organization to advise or make those kinds of recommendations. So we're not expecting council to be experts in asphalt.
No, sorry, a different. I was speaking more generally about what goes in an information update versus a report through a committee. And I was asking if one of the differences is that if there's a request for council to do something, to take a step, to approve something, to enact a bylaw, whatever, that is a report that goes through the committee and council process. An information update, and I'm asking you if you would agree with this characterization, is a more informal way of updating council about the progress or developments in a project. But the information update itself does not contain a request for council to take a step.
Correct.
Okay. And this update is in June of 2007. And in the called out section, it contains an explanation both of perpetual pavement and the use of stone mastic asphalt on the surface course, and lists a couple of the benefits that come along with the use of stone mastic asphalt. Do you know if this 2007 information update was the first time council was made aware that SMA would be used on the Red Hill?
I can't say for certain. It's difficult with, recalling, 15 years of history, but yeah, I can't say for certain.
Okay. The information report highlights two features of SMA: improved skid resistance and lower noise generation. At this time, we're now 2007, what do you remember about what you knew about stone mastic asphalt's ability to improve skid resistance?
I would not, it's obviously not my profession. It's not my background. It's not my expertise. So that would be my answer.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember that being a topic of much discussion between you and others in the project?
No, it wasn't of much discussion. My interest, I think, as I had indicated, in trying to find ways to lessen the consequences of this project environmentally as broadly defined. The lower noise generation was certainly of interest to me in particular.
Given your role, was the lower noise generation more important to you than the skid resistance features of SMA?
No, I wouldn't want to contrast one against the other. We're obviously designing and building a road that meets engineering requirements, and but also at the same time trying to address some of the environmental consequences of building a road in the valley. So we were trying to accomplish basically two fundamental objectives.
Do you remember in the discussion of, take a step back, do you recall any discussion of any problems with early age friction levels on stone mastic asphalt in 2007?
No.
Over time, as we know that the history of the project was quite long, and there were a number of delays to the planned execution of the construction schedule. And the overview document summarizes a number of cost increases that happened over time. That the work was bid, but by the time it was executed, cost had increased. Input costs, steel costs, asphalt, a bunch of construction costs had increased. And over time, you had to explain that the budget of the Red Hill Valley Parkway project was needed to be increased in order to build it at that time, as opposed to when some of the other plans were made. Do you recall whether or not councillors expressed significant concerns to you about the increased budget for construction?
They didn't.
Registrar, if I could ask you to turn up overview document 3, image 65. On October 16th, 2007, the MTO conducted friction testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway. By this time, you have left your role as the acting project director, and you are now the director of housing. Did you know in 2007, at any time in 2007, that the MTO had conducted friction testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I don't recall, no.
Do you recall when you first learned that the MTO had conducted friction testing on the Red Hill?
I mean, it's been more of a recent understanding that which is subject of this whole process that we're in. So
after your departure from the city?
Correct.
Okay. Prior to your exit from the role as acting project director, did you ever discuss with Mr. Moore or Mr. Odie the idea of conducting friction testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I can't be 100% confident saying one way or another.
Okay. Do you recall any such conversation, though?
Again, time period before I left?
Before you left the acting project director role?
I mean, there was a document that spoke to the operations and maintenance of the project.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that contained information about friction testing or not, I don't have a specific recollection of that. But I do of wanting to make sure that, you know, as this project left the construction and became a project that was going to be the subject of operations and maintenance requirements, that there was, you know, some guidelines that were going to be provided to other parties in the organization to look after.
And that, am I right? I think, are you referring to the scan test?
No.
No, I've got that. I'll come back to that. That comes a little bit later in time. Do you, in your role as acting project director, did you have any direct discussions with Dr. Ludimir Uzarowski from Golder Associates?
About stone SMA or any?
Taking one step more generally, did you have any direct conversations with it?
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you recall whether you ever discussed with Dr. Uzarowski, the MTO or anyone else conducting friction testing on the Red Hill?
No.
Registrar, if I could ask you to turn up overview document 4, page 50. And if I could ask you to please call out paragraph 111 and the text below it. And Mr. Murray, this is an email chain that does not involve you. Originates within the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario, discussing the upcoming friction test, potential of upcoming friction testing at the MTO. And in the second and third line of the email, it says he mentioned that there are very limited City of Hamilton staff around this week, including the project manager, so we may not get the result for a few days. By this time, you are no longer acting project director. You've moved on to become the director of housing. Did anyone ever discuss with you the possibility of the MTO conducting friction testing on the Red Hill Valley?
No, I don't recall.
Okay. Before you left the City of Hamilton, did you ever see any friction test results from the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No.
I understand that from time to time there were periodic meetings with representatives of the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario to do things like coordinate the construction and discuss the interchange between the Red Hill Valley Parkway and the QEW. Did you attend those meetings?
Those high-level meetings, yes.
Okay. And at those high-level meetings, do you recall the topic of friction testing the Red Hill Valley in 2007 ever coming up?
I don't recall that, no.
You left to become the Director of Housing on June 18th, 2007. And I believe that that was after paving had just started on the Red Hill, but before the SMA surface layer had been placed. Does that accord with your recollection?
I don't have it. I don't have those specific dates in mind. I certainly had left the project director role, and as you point out, and became housing director in June. And so I think my understanding is that paving had started, but I certainly wasn't in my former role to see it through completion.
After you became Director of Housing, did you have any residual ongoing role with the Red Hill Valley project?
I did attend an event when the road was eventually opened, and I think I emceed it. And that would have been my last official or semi-official anything to do with the project.
And any ongoing day-to-day responsibilities from June when you stepped into your new role as Director of Housing until you emceed and cut the ribbon on the opening of the roadway?
So, okay, sorry, is there a question there, or are you?
There was. So no day-to-day responsibilities between the time you became the Director of Housing and the emceeing of the opening?
Correct.
As Director of Housing, did you have any ongoing interactions with Mr. Moore or Mr. Odie?
No. As it relates to this project?
Yes, as it relates to this project.
No.
You became city manager in January of 2009.
Correct.
In your time as project director, were you aware of that Golder Associates was one of the consulting engineers on the Red Hill Valley project? Did that name, was that a meaningful name to you?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. When you were acting project director, did you know that a company called Golder Associates was one of the consulting engineers on the project?
Yes.
In 2009, did you know that Golder was preparing for the City of Hamilton phase 1 of the pavement and materials technology review? And that report was delivered to the city in November of 2009. Did you have any insight into that project?
No.
Okay. Right, so if I could ask you to call up overview document 3, page 77. And call out paragraph E. In 2009, did you know that Golder Associates received the 2009 Ontario Consulting Engineers Award for its work on the perpetual pavement on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I don't recall, no.
That award was presented to Golder Associates on June 2nd, 2009 in Ottawa. Did you know that Mr. Moore attended that ceremony?
I wouldn't have known at that time, no.
Did you know at that time that Golder Associates paid for Mr. Moore and his wife to fly from Toronto to Ottawa and back to attend the ceremony?
No.
Did you know that Golder Associates paid for Mr. Moore and his wife to stay 2 nights at the Chateau Laurier?
No.
In 2009, did Mr. Moore ever discuss with you the fact that Golder offered this trip to him?
No, I don't recall that at all.
Do you recall anyone raising this issue with you?
No.
Registrar, if you could please turn up HAM 58896. As city manager, Mr. Murray, you were familiar with the city's code of conduct policy that applied to all of its employees?
Correct.
And this policy was first approved in 1995. And at the top, it says eligibility, all employees. Am I correct that all employees were expected to comply with this policy? That's what eligibility means in this context?
I agree.
Okay. Registrar, if you could please highlight the first sentence of the italicized, the text in the box beginning "the city expects." Policy begins with the sentence, "The city expects every employee to conduct themselves with the highest degree of personal integrity and ethics." And Registrar, if you could also highlight the leading text of paragraph 4 that begins conflicts of interest and stops before the indented text. One paragraph down, thank you. So you agree with Mr. Murray that policy starts out by stating an expectation that employees will conduct themselves with the highest degree of integrity and ethics, and then explains that conflicts of interest and breaches of trust can take many forms. It is impossible to list them all. What follows is a list of some of the more obvious examples. I could ask you, Registrar, to call up image 2, leave image 1 up and call up image 2. And if I could ask you to highlight paragraph 2. Mr. Bray, do you agree this is a broad prohibition on accepting benefits from any business that has a contract with the region to supply goods or services unless that benefit is available to all persons?
Could I just, and I apologize, could you?
No, please take your
again,
time.
I want to make sure I read it.
Can we call that out, please? The paragraph we just highlighted, if we could also call it out so it's easier to read. Thank you.
Well, I think your summation, Mr. Santa, is correct.
Thank you. And to be fair, in paragraph 4, there is an exclusion from the policy for gifts and benefits of nominal value. So it's not all gifts and benefits. There's a explicit exclusion for gifts and benefits of nominal value. In this case, it appears that Golder Associates spent at least $888 on the flights and the hotel room from the documents. Would $880, Mr. Murray, have exceeded your definition of nominal value in 2009?
Yes.
Registrar, if you could please call up image 3 of this document. And if you could highlight and call out, or just call out the last paragraph. Begins caution, yes. It says, caution is always the best guide to behavior in this area. Employees are encouraged to discuss any circumstance about which they have the least doubts. I think that should say least doubts with their supervisor or department head. And I think you told me earlier that Mr. Moore did not discuss whether or not he should accept this offer with you.
Correct.
If Mr. Moore had discussed Golder's offer with you, what would your advice to him have been as city manager in 2009?
I think this sentence allows us an opportunity as an organization to decide whether we would provide that support. So again, I look at it on the face value that you're presenting it, and I think if it would have been presented to me, I would have found another way, one that doesn't create the situation that I think this creates. Meaning, I would have entertained, the idea of potentially sending Mr. Moore. But again, it's I would have considered it. It's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily mean I would have done it, but I would have considered it.
When you say you would have considered finding another way of getting Mr. Moore to attend the event without having Golder pay the costs of the flight and the hotel.
Correct. I would have considered another option, not necessarily agreeing to do it, but just I would have considered it at least.
I understand. Would you have considered just approving Mr. Moore to accept the benefit?
No.
Mr. Moore, I'd like to ask you some questions about some consultants' reports about the Red Hill Valley Parkway that were prepared in 2013 and 2014. So we're moving ahead in time from where we've been. In 2013, if you're able to situate yourself in that at that point in time, were you aware that city staff had received complaints from citizens and the police about perceived slippery conditions on the Red Hill Valley Parkway, especially during wet weather?
Don't recall, no.
In fall 2013, did you know that Mr. Moore had requested that Golder Associates conduct friction testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No.
And to be fair to you, given your span of control as city manager, is that the sort of thing you would have expected someone to tell you?
No.
In 2014, did you ever see a copy of the Tradewind report, which was the friction testing that was done on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No.
Did anyone talk to you about that report?
No.
In 2014, did you see or otherwise learn about the Golder Associates report on the state of the Red Hill Valley Parkway? And that was the overarching report to which the Tradewind report became an appendix and was discussed. It was, but the bigger report from Golder Associates. Did you ever see that?
No, I didn't.
Okay. And similar question, did anyone talk to you about the existence of the Golder report?
No, and to your earlier comment, I wouldn't expect them to provide me those kinds of fine details, if you will.
Sure. As a general rule, if a report from a consultant identified matters of concern to public safety, what was your expectation about what a city staff member who receives that report should do next?
Well, we retain consultants for a variety of reasons, one of which is to rely on their expertise. I think one has to treat public safety as high on our list as any consideration that we're ever going to give anything. So I would expect that it would be, taken seriously and dealt with accordingly. Now, I just want to provide a little bit more context to what I just said. As you point out, not aware of the reports, not aware of what's in the reports. So I've answered the question, I think, in a very kind of generic way.
No, and that's very fair. And I'm not, these questions are not in any way designed to suggest that you had actual knowledge of the existence of the report. I think that the documentary evidence suggests otherwise. My question was more general, and it goes to your expectations as the city manager, recognizing that you can't and don't expect to see all of the reports that are being generated by all of the departments under your span of control.
That's correct.
My question was when a staff person gets one of those reports that suggests that there may be an issue related to public safety, about your expectations about what they do next. And what I took from your answer was you expected to take it seriously because of the priority that's placed on public safety. If a staff member receives such a report, is it your expectation that the staff person would escalate the report and share it to receive input from others about what to do next?
Again, in this particular case, I think context is everything. So that would be an option, certainly. But again, I don't know what's in the report. I don't know how.
Sure.
I don't know how what the consultant would be recommending, how it's said, what emphasis. So I mean, we're talking in very generic terms right now. So I would, but I think that what you described is an option, certainly, and So, and again, I don't know enough about the report to say one way or another it should be X or Y.
And I'm not asking about a particular report. I'm rather asking about the expectations that you had of your staff and the expectations that you set for the organization. So starting with a more general question than the specifics of this report, I'm trying to understand as a municipal leader at the time how you would have expected your staff to respond, and it is admittedly in a generic situation, somewhat removed from this report.
Well, again, given the serious or the risk that's being communicated by the consultant,
right?
Making a determination as to the magnitude of that risk, and the likelihood of that risk becoming something that needs to be addressed.
Right.
The chain of command that does exist in any municipal organization is certainly is there for a reason, and I would expect that if the nature of the risk is such that it's material, then certainly whoever is that individual is directly accountable to that person should be given the courtesy of knowing what's being said and the importance of that.
Thank you. I want to ask you some questions about interactions between counselors and staff in the context of consultants' reports. If a counselor asks a staff person for a copy of a consultant's report, how would you expect the staff person to respond to that request?
I mean, generally speaking, we like to share information with all members of council, including the mayor, and I think that's how we're expected to treat council and the mayor fairly. So in this particular case, for a counselor to ask for a copy of a consultant's report, it's not a daily occurrence. I can say that.
If a staff person does not want to provide the report to the counselor for whatever reason, how should the staff member proceed? Should they discuss it with their supervisor? Is this a topic of conversation, or is it a decision that is left to the individual staff member?
Usually we're aware of issues that are being raised by members of council, in these kinds of one-on-one situations that you're describing. And so I don't think it would be unusual to communicate, a particular counselor is looking for a report, and what decision the individual may have made. That said, I mean, a member of council can, through a standing committee and ultimately council, request any information that they want from us.
You mentioned in one of your earlier answers that I think the way you put it was you wanted to facilitate information sharing. If a staff person in a different city department asks for a copy of a consultant's report because they felt the report contained information that was useful to them to do their job, what would you have expected the custodian, the staff person who had custody of the report, to do when asked for a copy of it?
I mean, given the nature of municipalities, I mean, we are responsible for delivery of a variety of services. We find ourselves more often than not working in collaboration with each other. So the idea of sharing information, with other members of staff that have a direct, even a tangential interest or need for information, I mean, should be something that is encouraged and acted upon.
And if the person who had requested the report could not obtain it from the other staff member who had the report, in general, what should they do next?
I would expect that they would raise the matter with superior and but it, you know, I mean, and then, you know, ensure that you know, the extra effort is made to obtain what is necessary.
In 2013, SEMA, the consulting company SEMA, was retained to conduct the Red Hill Valley Parkway Safety Review. Did you have any involvement in that project?
No,
Did you have any involvement in drafting or editing the staff report that went to Public Works Committee and City Council about that report?
no.
Given the amount of reports that are generated at the city, was it your practice at the time to review all reports that were going to a committee of council?
No. What is the practice though is to have at least an understanding of, you know, the types of information that are going to the various standing committees. So, and, you know, to have some sense of that. That would be about the level of involvement that I would generally have, unless something is brought to my attention causing me to have to focus on something. And if that occurs, then there's a different level of consideration that I have to give it.
And I take it you would rely on the directors that were reporting to you to flag for you issues of particular concern or where they wanted your input or advice on a matter.
The general managers, yes. And those general managers I would meet with regularly as a senior leadership team.
Right.
Yeah.
On November 18th, 2013, report PW 13081 went to the Public Works Committee, and it was an information report about the 2013 SEMA report. That information report that was prepared by staff did not attach a copy of the consultant's report. It was just the staff summary of it. Did you have a view in your role about whether or not consultants' reports should be included alongside the staff report that went to the committee?
Could you maybe rephrase the question? Are you suggesting that consultant reports be attached to all reports of staff to committee and council?
I'm asking if you have a view as to whether or not consultants' reports should always be attached to staff reports that go to committee.
Well, I mean, that would be a lot of information, and you know, in fairness to our elected officials, sure. For them to have to go through what could be in a given, you know, standing committee meeting, ultimately council meeting, an awful lot of information. So I don't know how practical that really is.
What factors should staff bear in mind when deciding whether or not to include a consultant's report with us alongside a staff report?
Well, again, I use the word risk. And I think if there's, you know, something that is material in that sense, that would be potentially one reason. But again, you know, you're asking in general, and again, everything that we do, you know, needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So, you know, I have to be cognizant of, I think, your question, but, and, again, I as a report author, I would ask myself the question, what is it that is going to be important for, representatives of the public to understand and communicate it accordingly.
If the consultant's report is not attached to the staff report, so the staff report is going to committee on its own, does that increase the importance that the staff report accurately and completely describe the consultant's report that is not attached?
Again, you're asking me generally speaking. I would expect there'd be some reference to the consultant report. I would expect that it would summarize the salient details that are important from a decision-making standpoint. So I think it, in capturing really what the consultant was saying would be an important consideration in anything staff would put forward to a standing committee or council.
In your view, is it appropriate for staff to share a draft of a consultant's report with some, but not all members of the committee?
A standing committee of council?
Standing committee of council.
That is not a typical practice.
Do you see any dangers with that practice?
Well, I mean, I won't say I've read every single page of the Collingwood inquiry, but I would say it starts to call into question some of those findings in terms of the relationship between the administration and council.
Mm-hmm. And one of those dangers that you then have members of the committee operating with different levels of information about the topic at hand.
Yeah, as I think I said before, Mr. Senta, that is a concern. As well, though, the role that we play as an administration in terms of, helping an elected group make an informed decision. So,
right.
It's our job to give, our best advice.
Mm-hmm.
And that advice sometimes is informed by consultants, and capturing the essence of what the consultant report is saying in a report that we would give, as I said, noting that we're basing some of what we're writing on a consultant's report. Those would be, I think, a reasonable approach to informing council.
Mm-hmm. In your experience, how much input should city staff have into the text of a consultant's report?
If there's factual errors,
mm-hmm.
those need to be pointed out. But again, typically when we're working with specialists, we are purchasing their expertise.
Right. And as you said, correcting factual errors is important so the consultant's report proceeds on a sound factual footing. Beyond that, do you see dangers in staff taking on a role editing and revising consultants' reports?
Yeah, it's a context, and I apologize for repeating myself here, but context is everything. I mean, factual errors, or there could be other circumstances where we might advise or suggest. But I think if I understand the basis of your question, I'm not when we retain and compensate a specialist firm to provide advice. It's,
Mhm.
assuming that, the facts are facts and that there's no other, concerning matter that we should be accepting their advice as it's been stated.
Thank you. In May of 2015, there was an accident on the Red Hill Valley Parkway that killed two young women, Olivia Smzarski and Jordan Hastings. The fairly high profile collision resulting in two fatalities. Do you recall that accident?
I do.
Registrar, if I could ask you to call up HAM 58622. And Mr. Murray, this is an email chain that you exchanged with someone named Darlene Barber.
Mhm.
Who is Darlene Barber?
And my executive assistant.
And in the second email from the top, which you sent at 9:47 p.m., you wrote, "The fact that it was on the Red Hill makes what is unimaginably sad even worse." Can you explain what you meant when you wrote that?
Yes. As pointed out at the very beginning of today's testimony, this project has had a very long, difficult history. And even after it's completed, as evident of this hearing, it continues to be challenged in different ways. And so in this particular situation, as you go further down the email chain here, you see that this is one of the young women that was killed. Mom worked for the city of Hamilton.
Yep.
That obviously, when we look at our staff and what we try to do to support our staff, is very difficult. So there's actually a third reason why my email is, and my daughter would have been around their age.
At this time, May of 2015, did you have any concerns about the safety record of the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I didn't. None that were brought to my attention.
Right. That was going to be my next question. Had you heard anything, anecdotally or otherwise, that raised concerns about the slipperiness of the parkway or its safety record in May of 2015?
No, and there was nothing that was brought to my attention that, all roadways, as you know, no matter how straight or not that they are, whatever their grade may be, will present challenges. So I don't have or was given anything that in my capacity as city manager to cause me to start to seriously question the safety of that road.
Following the accident in May of 2015, and we'll come to this, SEMA is retained to do a further investigation of the safety of the Red Hill. In the discussions around or that followed this accident, did anyone bring to your attention the friction test results from Tradewind or the Golder report that was prepared and delivered in draft in January of 2014?
No, and I wouldn't have expected it. As pointed out earlier.
Mm-hmm. Registrar, if I could ask you to call up HAM 47. I'm sorry, just before we move off that, thank you, Ms. Leclerc. This document we were just looking at HAM 58622 should be marked as the next exhibit.
Noted, Council. Exhibit 36.
Registrar, I can ask you to now take us to HAM 4779.
Sorry, Council, do you mind repeating that?
No, HAM 4779.
Thank you.
And if I could ask you to go to the second image. Mr. Murray, this is an email you received from a member of the public in October of 2015, and she's asking you some questions about the timing of the delivery of certain reports, including the report that we're going to talk about, which is the 2015 SEMA report. You respond to her and copy in Dave Ferguson and pass the issue along to Mr. Ferguson to ask him to respond. And that is your last involvement in the email chain. You're not copied on any of the emails that happen later, but I want to ask you a question because you're mentioned in it. So if I could, Registrar, if we could please go back to the first image. And if you could call out, Registrar, the first substantive email from Mr. White that was sent at 2:14, if you could call out the text beginning, Jeff, we already had a draft written, down to the include the paragraph that begins frankly. And Mr. Murray, this is an email discussion among Martin White, Jeff Lupton, and Dave Ferguson. And again, you're not copied into this message. And Mr. White is talking about the draft report and raises some concerns that the report is recommending guide rail and lighting review and asphalt testing, all the things Gary argues against. And I believe in context, that's a reference to Mr. Moore. Despite that, I believe them to be prudent and required that we do this ethically and technically responsibly. We can talk after Dave sends it to us. Thanks. He concludes, frankly, I think Chris Murray should be in on the discussions. He built the roadways. We can prevent some of these accidents from occurring, and we should take action. Do you recall after October 30th, whether or not you were involved in any discussions about the content of the 2015 SEMA report or the staff report to council about that report?
No, I don't.
Do you remember ever discussing the draft 2015 SEMA report with Mr. Ferguson or Mr. White?
I did not.
In the fall of 2015, did you know whether or not Mr. Moore had any opinions regarding the certain recommendations made by SEMA?
No.
Registrar, if I could ask you to please call up overview document 2, page 13. And if I could actually, if we go back to image 12, I need the unfortunate pair. There we go. Thank you. Perfect. On March 30th, 2015, City Council directed the city manager to review the size and scope of the Public Works Department. Do you remember that exercise?
I do.
What prompted this review?
A comment made by the general manager
The general manager of,
Public Works, sorry.
and what was that comment?
That he felt that it was too much to have to manage.
And
I'm
who was the,
paraphrasing, those aren't the exact words, but that's what my memory,
I understand. And who was the general manager of Public Works at that time?
Jerry Davis.
And did Mr. Davis describe how his concerns about the department being too large to be managed, how that problem was manifesting itself on a day-to-day basis at the city?
I don't recall that exactly, as the way you put it.
Mhm.
You know, I do recall talking to Jerry about, or Mr. Davis, sorry, about, you know, what's occupying his, you know, day-to-day responsibilities. And, you know, there is, and this is a general statement,
Mhm.
you know, from time to time, even as you know, you move up an organizational chart, you always have to be thinking about, am I doing the work that is necessary at this level of the organization? So if you find yourself getting into the weeds, you know, then you have to ask yourself, am I allocating responsibility the way I should be? And so at the time, and I don't have, you know, total recall as to all the things that were on Jerry's plate, which were, you know, where, as with any general manager, there's always things that you're having to, you know, to manage, the day-to-day things, but also the direction that your department is moving in. I think it was probably as a result of just that plate being full that led to his comment that he made at, I believe it was council. I could be wrong. But I think that's what triggered the request of council to direct me to go look into it. And that's what I did.
And do you recall whether or not Mr. Davis expressed any concerns about information sharing or information overload as being concerns that he had as the general manager?
No, not information sharing, I think, in the context of the way you've presented it here today. No, that was not an information overload. I mean, we are, you can imagine, I think, as a city manager, just the broad array of what goes on in an organization, what it is that you have to focus on, and those things that you're going to have to rely on others to take care of. I don't recall specifically those words with Jerry, information overload. So, but I can certainly appreciate, you know, the challenges of being a general manager in general, whether it's public works or planning economic development or whatever. There's a lot of demands put on you, you know, in your day-to-day, including the, you know, the work that you do with council, et cetera. So.
You described the dangers of a general manager being too in the, I think you put it in the weeds, and needing to ensure that decisions are being made at the appropriate level of the organization. Given the range of responsibilities at the city manager level and the general manager levels, from your perspective, how important is the ability to delegate effectively to others to achieve the goals of senior staff?
I think it's quite important. And in fact, if you go back to the charter that's exactly what that document was intended to do, is to make clear who the project sponsor was, to make clear what my role was, to make clear what others in the office roles. That setting out of roles and responsibilities, even in a project, is important.
Right.
Not just for those that are there, but others that may join that office to understand what that office does. But take that example and think about it from the standpoint of a department and how that department relates to the city manager, and that should give you some idea of how you would delineate roles, responsibilities, and ultimately accountabilities.
What was the answer to the question, is the Public Works Department too large?
It wasn't.
When you were, take you back in time, and I want to ask you some questions about working with Mr. Moore. When you were the acting director for the Red Hill Valley project, Mr. Moore reported to you. Was that the first time you had worked with him?
No.
What was your previous experience working with him?
When I joined Hamilton Wentworth in 1995, I was part of the Special Projects Office, and Gary was a member of that office. In fact, I think he was a manager at the time. And its responsibilities were one part, the Lincoln Alexander / Red Hill, but also we were doing road EAs in general. And and as well as cycling. And so I came in as a frontline unionized planner. And so that's when I first met Gary.
Over the years in working with him, I take it you had the opportunity to observe his skills as an engineer?
Correct.
Recognizing that you're not an engineer, what was your opinion of his engineering skills?
I'd worked before joining the region of Hamilton Wentworth for a consulting firm that specialized in engineering, planning, and architecture. And so most of my career has been spent working with engineers up until I started to do housing and then the pursuits that I'm involved with now. So certainly exposed to a number of different engineers, and I felt Gary was talented, and in comparison to many that I've worked with directly, I thought to be quite a good engineer, as well as Marco, Mr. Odie.
Mr. Odie. And from your perspective and based on what you knew at the time, did you feel he made a positive contribution to the work of the Red Hill Valley project?
Yes.
How, given his length of involvement with the project, how would you describe his importance to completing the project and getting the roadway open?
Well, Gary was certainly key, individual responsible for the Lincoln Alexander roadway, as well as the completion of the Red Hill. So not just, some historical knowledge or understanding, but also, played a critically important role, certainly in the project office that I had joined back in '95, and had worked under John Vandermark, who reported to Dale Turvey as commissioner. So certainly historical knowledge was considerable, and as well as engineering knowledge was considerable.
Registrar, if I could ask you to turn up Hamilton HAM 58739. This is a document titled City of Hamilton Performance Accountability and Development Form. Are you familiar with these kinds of forms?
Yes.
What is its purpose?
evaluate the performance of a senior official within the organization.
This one is for Mr. Moore in 2017, and you are listed at the top as the reviewer, as in your position as city manager. What does that mean?
Well, it's, you know, I obviously would assess the performance of those that report to me directly, and obviously I want to know how those that report to the general managers, how they're performing. So it gives me a line of sight, not just to the immediate reports, but to the more indirect reports to understand how their teams are functioning. And so a reviewer in the sense that, you know, I have an opportunity to see whether or not there are, you know, how the work is getting done, and so it gives me that kind of line of sight into that level of the organization. So reviewer in that context.
I thank you. And this is the form for Mr. Moore, who is then the Director of Engineering Services. Just below his title, there's the leader, Daniel McKinnon, the GM of Public Works. So that's Mr. Moore, who reports to Mr. McKinnon, and Mr. McKinnon reports to you. So you become the reviewer of Mr. McKinnon's assessment of Mr. Moore. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. And Registrar, could we go to image 5, please? This is not the best copy of a document we've looked at today. So let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Registrar, if you could please call out the block of small text that begins, Gary has had another. Thank you. Oh, that's better. Can you see that okay, or would you prefer to resize the text box?
Just shrink it a little bit more. That'd be
Sure.
much appreciated. Yeah.
And the end of that comment box, the last couple of sentences read, Gary's career is marked by the delivery of significant city-shaping capital projects, as well as a capital program that was successfully delivered year after year. Gary and I continue to have fundamental differences around leadership style, but having said that, I feel Gary and I agree on the fundamentals of many issues, and I always appreciate our spirited conversations. I wish Gary all the best going forward. And if we could also call out, Registrar, the handwritten comments below the reviewer box that begin, yeah, that part of the document, yes. Mr. Murray, I think that's your handwriting.
Correct.
If you could read what you wrote into the record for us.
I wrote, I fully appreciate the use of the term spirited in quotation marks.
Mm-hmm.
When done the right way, it's great. Otherwise, I can't see the rest of it, sorry. I just need the bottom part.
Maybe we could get rid, yeah, if we could move it up the screen a little bit, thank you.
Otherwise problematic.
Okay, thank you. What did you mean by that?
Gary's very direct. And, you know, and not everyone is direct in their comments and their style. So he's a challenger. And I've worked with a number of challengers, not just in the engineering field, but in your field and many other fields. And I know for some people, people who tend to ask a lot of questions and do so in a very straightforward, direct way,
mm-hmm.
You know, it can create, you know, some problems, you know, so just in terms of relationships, just that's what I mean by that. So, but, you know, as I think I've said in my submission to this process, you know, prior to joining the region and then the city, obviously, I've worked with very direct people who challenge my statements, and I find working in that environment to be very straightforward and helpful. So he is spirited, and he's not one to leave you reading between the lines. So there's value in that.
In your experience with Mr. Moore, was he spirited the right way or in the problematic way?
Well, the right way with me.
Were you ever made aware of any complaints about Mr. Moore being spirited in the problematic way?
So I'm sorry to just interrupt Mr. Senta during the course of these questions. I just want to make sure I understand the relevance of Mr. Murray's assessments of Mr. Moore. I just were raising some question as to what extent are we heading down the direction of trying to understand what is meant by spirited in the right way and spirited in the wrong way.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Letterman. Commissioner, term of reference number 3 for the inquiry is, why was the information in the Tradewind report or the information and recommendations contained therein not provided to council or the public once the report was submitted to the Department of Engineering Services in 2014? Term of reference number 5 is, was there any negligence, malfeasance, or misconduct in failing to provide the report or the information and recommendations contained therein to council and the public? And in term of reference number 15, you are asked to identify any changes to the city's bylaws, policies, and procedures to prevent any such future incidents of non-disclosure of significant information. And we have in the overview documents documentary evidence that suggests that city employees were aware and would joke that Mr. Moore would from time to time get angry with other city employees. Registrar, if you could please call up overview document 8, pages 33 and 34.
Well, just, sorry, if I could just ask a question before we get to that.
Sure.
I understood Mr. Senta to be connecting this line of questioning to the terms of reference that he just identified. Before we start looking at other documents contained in the overview document, I guess what I'm struggling with is understanding the connection between asking Mr. Murray for his assessment of being spirited in the right way and spirited in the wrong way in relation to the specific terms of reference that Mr. Senta identified. I don't think by looking at these documents that really addresses that question of relevance. That's the point that I'm trying to understand.
Sure. One of the questions at the heart of the inquiry is, why was the Tradewind report not shared with other employees? And we will be hearing some evidence from employees as to their understanding of why that happened. Trying to understand and answer that question of why is crucial to answering term of reference 3 and term of reference 5. It may also be necessary for the commissioner to address additional policies and procedures, among other things, to include ensuring that steps are taken to improve the information flow among employees. But trying to get at the heart of why this report was not shared in my view, it is appropriate and relevant for us to put before you, Commissioner, evidence that sheds light on Mr. Moore's interpersonal relations with other employees, in some ways his managerial skills, not because conclusions have been drawn already, but because it is evidence that we think will help you understand the dynamics at play in the department, and ultimately answer the question of why this report was not shared. And we are attempting to be fair to all participants when we ask questions about why that report was not shared and utilized by members of the traffic department, among others. And that's the relevance that we see between these questions and some of the evidence that has already been placed in the overview documents.
If I could just reply to that, I appreciate that is the exercise that is intended. And indeed, if there is specific evidence that relates to those terms of reference that shows that there was a connection between that and any issue around the disclosure of the trade, then obviously we want to hear that evidence. What I'm concerned about are, particularly when we're talking about any term of reference dealing with the suggestion of misconduct, that if we're talking about personal reputations, then character evidence at large about people's assessment as to how they acted is not the correct way of leading relevant evidence that will assist this inquiry in answering questions and specifically those terms of reference. So that's the concern that I have, is that we don't want to turn this inquiry into witnesses being called upon to express their views or their opinions about individual character traits at large. If there's obviously a specific piece of evidence or a connection to one's behavior, one's attitude to the terms of reference, then absolutely those questions should be asked and answered during the course of this inquiry.
Mr. Santa, anything further?
No, except to say that I don't think that the evidence that I described or was eliciting from Mr. Murray is properly described as character evidence. It is evidence of how Mr. Moore interacted with his supervisor, to whom he may or may not have shared the Tradewind report. And I think that is right at the center bullseye of the terms of reference that you've been asked to address.
Right.
Nothing further.
So it may be that the issue really arises as a result of the rather general words, spirited, rightly or wrongly. Perhaps I'm going to suggest that the substantive issue is clear. It goes beyond simply Mr. Moore's interaction with respect to this one particular matter, the Tradewind report, and questions along that line are certainly appropriate. With respect to his character, I think we have to stay away from general questions about his character and concentrate more on his relationships with other people, both in his department and in other members of the Public Works Department. So perhaps I might ask you to rephrase the question, avoiding the language of spirited and focusing on the dynamic questions of his relationships.
That's fine. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
turn then to, I note that it is 11:30, Commissioner. I don't anticipate that I will need more than about 15 or 20 minutes following the break, but this might be an appropriate time to take the break so that I can canvass with council their expected time for cross-examination. And then when we can come back, if we could come back at, let's say, if it would be okay with you, 11:50, we can, I'm sure, give you a roadmap for the rest of the day.
Sure, that would be fine. Let's take a break and return. Stand adjourned then until 11:50.
Registrar, can I ask that you put all council in the one breakout room together?
Yes, Council.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Registrar, if I could ask you to call up RHV 890. Mr. Murray, this is an anonymous letter that was delivered to the city's internal auditor, and copies were sent to the mayor's office and also to representatives of the media. Are you the author of this letter?
No,
Do you know who wrote it?
do not.
Registrar, could you please call out the first bullet? Mr. Murray, would you say that you have a personal interest in the Parkway?
No,
Did you ever take steps to avoid exposing flaws in the Parkway?
exposing flaws?
Did you ever take steps to avoid exposing flaws in the Parkway?
Never to avoid exposing flaws, no.
Thank you. To the best of your knowledge, did the name change Red Hill Valley Parkway to Red Hill Valley Parkway have anything to do with the design standards used on the roadway?
No, it did not.
Thank you. Registrar, if you could stop that call out and go to image 2. And please call out the first paragraph, first full paragraph below the bulleted paragraph. Mr. Murray, please describe how Mr. Moore came to retire from the city and then go to work on the LRT project.
I think he had reached his number of years and was eligible to retire. I can't speak to whether or not it was with or without any penalty. I don't know, nor have I looked into those details. But certainly, the reason for involving him in the LRT was, given the nature of the LRT project, affecting both surface and subsurface infrastructure, Gary's job, or Mr. Moore's job, as being responsible for capital and engineering, it'd be hard to find anyone that has a more complete knowledge of the city's infrastructure than Gary.
And did you recommend him for the job with the LRT?
I did.
And did you do so for the reasons that you just described?
Correct.
Did you have any concerns about Mr. Moore's work at the city that prompted you to want him to retire?
No.
Thank you. If we could end that call out, please. And if you could call out the 8 italicized sentences in the lower part of the page. Mr. Murray, the letter contains 8 examples of statements the author attributes to Mr. Moore. To the best of your knowledge, did Mr. Moore ever speak in this manner?
Not in this matter at all.
Did you ever observe Mr. Moore to be quick to anger with fellow coworkers?
Not anger at all. Opinion, yeah, absolutely, and direct in the manner which I said earlier. So, yeah, I don't. When I look at this, it's unfortunate. Let's just say that.
And finally, did you ever see any signs of Mr. Moore bullying other city staff to get his way on a particular decision?
Again, Mr. Santa, I think, Gary has an ability to get to the point and to make his opinions known and to challenge people. So And I want to be accurate in answering your question. So if you could just restate your question so that I'm accurate.
Sure. My question was, did you ever see Mr. Moore, any signs of Mr. Moore bullying other city staff in order to get his way on a particular decision?
No.
Thank you. Commissioner, those are my questions for Mr. Murray, and I anticipate that we will be able to complete the cross-examinations by the lunch break. We have spoken to council and got their time estimates. If it is agreeable to council, I might suggest that we start with the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. I don't believe that Dufferin or Golder have any questions, but if that's changed over the break, council, please just let me know, and then we can turn to the city for their questions.
Yeah, excuse the witness. I do want to express a concern just about that last document that was raised with respect to questions of admissibility and questions as to weight associated with an anonymous document. Obviously, as you know, Commissioner, an anonymous piece of correspondence can't be tested in any way. We don't know anything about the author of a document such as that, and as a result, I think there are two ways in which the courts have looked at treatment of anonymous documents. One is to render something like that to be inadmissible, and the other, from my review of the legal principles, are that any weight that would be ascribed to such a letter is typically either zero or next to zero. So I raise that because I'm a bit concerned that the document was put before the witness, and there's real questions as to the disability, whether it's in an administrative proceeding, civil proceeding, or judicial inquiry, as well as what weight can be given to such evidence.
Mhm.
And certainly at this point in time, Commission Counsel is not suggesting that any weight be given. That'll be a matter at the end of the day after all the evidence is heard. And in our view, in fairness, it is important to explore these issues and to give Mr. Murray, for example, an opportunity to expressly deny the allegations that are made in this letter. And he has done so. And exploring these issues, again, where someone has provided this letter to the city, one of the purposes of the inquiry is to explore the facts around allegations like this. Ultimately, it would be for you to draw the conclusions at the end of the day as to whether any weight should be ascribed to this letter or none at all. But at this point, those are, in our view, important issues to be aired and to be questions to be asked and answered. And Mr. Murray, you heard his evidence, unequivocal evidence on those points.
Well, I would just say in reply to that, absolutely, Mr. Senta and all participants can question Mr. Murray and other witnesses who are going to testify as to the issues in this proceeding that are set out by the terms of reference. That can be achieved without putting forward material that does not have any ability to be tested in the form of anonymous correspondence or other types of.
Right. So let me, if I may, just cut this short by a couple of comments. I said earlier when we had another question, this is an inquiry. The strict rules of evidence that apply in a trial, I think we all agree, do not necessarily apply here. There's a certain flexibility that is accommodated in a public inquiry. For that reason, I see no reason why the letter wouldn't be taken and received as an exhibit. But on the substantive point, based on where we are today, there is no weight that I would give to this particular document. I think I would give some weight to Mr. Murray's denials in respect to the questions put to him, but no weight to this particular document. If in the course of this trial something arises that requires that we revisit that assessment of the probative value of this document, then we'll address it at that point. And obviously you'll have every opportunity to make submissions then or at the end of the procedure after all the evidence is in. But I can assure you that I don't make determinations on the basis of an untested anonymous document, the contents of which are denied by the only witness who's asked to speak to them.
Then I appreciate that, Commissioner, and that's satisfactory. Thank you.
Is counsel for the Ministry of Transportation prepared to proceed?
I am, Commissioner. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Murray. My name is Heather McIver, and I'm counsel for MTO. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and I don't expect I'll be very long. Earlier today, Mr. Senta asked you whether you had any conversations regarding friction testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway before you left your position on the project. And you mentioned that there was a document that spoke to maintenance of the Parkway. And you said that it was intended to provide guidelines to other parts of the organization to look after maintenance. Is the document you're referring to the pavement sustainability plan that Stantec was assisting with?
No, it's not.
Okay, and you recall specifically a document that that recommended friction testing after the Parkway was constructed? Is that?
No, prior to the completion of the project, we'd undertaken some work to make sure that the maintenance and operations people, when they inherit the project, when it's operational, that they were clear on what it was they were inheriting. And the purpose of that, and the title of that escapes me right now, but the purpose of that document was to highlight some of the unique features that are part of this project. So, for example, the natural channel design. There were commitments made to the federal government under the Fisheries Act that allowed us to build one of the longest urban natural channel designs in certainly Canada. I think it goes beyond that. But it was important in receiving permission from the federal government, and for that matter, the provincial government, that we honor the certificates or the approvals that we were given. And it was important that we have a document that not only specifies that, but lays out some of the things that, people should be within our organization should be cognizant of and maintaining, so that we don't find ourselves out of compliance with those approvals. And so it also afforded us an opportunity to, as a project office, to give justification for others in the organization if they needed resources in order to manage what is a fairly unique project, to at least point to a document that says these are some of the unique situations or characteristics of this project. And so it was not just the environmental components, I believe it covered civil engineering components as well. So that's what my recollection is referring to.
Okay, and to your recollection, that also covered friction on the Parkway in some respect.
In some, I believe so, and I hesitated to speculate on anything.
Of course,
but I believe so.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Senta also asked you about meetings to discuss the QEW interchange, coordinate construction between the interchange and the Parkway. You indicated that you did attend some of those high-level meetings, and those would have been meetings with MTO staff. Is that your evidence?
They would have been, I believe, with Roger Hamner and the individual who I think took over for Roger when he left. So again.
Okay. And those would be the only two individuals that you were meeting with? Or
I can't be 100% certain.
okay. And now Mr. Odie spoke to attending meetings about the interchange as well. Would you and him both attend the same meetings, or are those different meetings?
No, mine would be, you know, more with the regional director at that kind of level. Specifics in terms of what I could describe as day-to-day type activities would be mostly in the hands of our engineering staff.
And Mr. Senta also asked whether friction matters ever came up at those meetings. You said, I believe you said, I don't recall. I just want to clarify, are you certain that they didn't occur, or you just can't recollect that far back?
Well, you know, again, I think we got to be careful we're not blurring timelines here, because there's the work prior to the opening of the Parkway, and then there's the work after. I have no recollection of any conversations with the provincial government about friction testing or anything, because I had moved on to be housing director and city manager. I don't recall there's, you know, that friction was an issue prior to the project being opened, and I don't recall having those kinds of conversations prior to my departure. Okay.
MTO's evidence will be prior to your departure, so into the spring of 2007. There were ongoing MTO industry discussions about changing from SMA on MTO contracts to super pave. And certainly individuals such as Mr. Hamner were kept apprised of these developments and whatnot. Is it possible that you discussed these issues with him?
Well, I'll just give you the first I've ever heard of super pave was about 3 seconds ago. So it's not a term I'm used to. So
okay, and you had no discussions about SMA in general at those meetings?
I don't recall that at all.
Okay, Mr. Murray, we heard that during your time on the project, or why don't I ask you, I'm not sure if this was your testimony, during your time on the project, did you form any safety concerns about issues on the Parkway in terms of construction or any related matters?
Not roadway safety. I mean, we had a role in our office to ensure that our environmental commitments that we had made vis-a-vis the approvals and certificates, that we build the project in a way that was compliant with those approvals.
Right.
So I think that's a very different answer to the question that you asked.
Okay, and so I take it, if we're talking about friction concerns or friction related safety concerns, that's not something that you would have reached out to individuals at MTO to discuss.
Correct.
Okay. And what about in your subsequent positions for the city of Hamilton, either as director of housing or city manager? Did you have any contact with MTO to flag any concerns about friction on the Red Hill?
No.
And now I appreciate, of course, you were in a different position by the time the Parkway opened. We heard that you had some interest in SMA because it was known to generate lesser noise, and that was, from your environmental perspective, seen as quite a benefit. Did you ever follow up or make any inquiries to assess whether the SMA effectively achieved that?
I'm trying to recall whether we had post-construction noise monitoring, and that may be something in that document that I referred to earlier as something that we would have monitored for. But I can't be 100% certain, so sorry about that.
Okay, and in the documents we saw earlier, along with the potential for reduced noise, there was the potential for increased skid resistance. So I take it there were no sort of post-construction inquiries on your end regarding the skid resistance quality of the highway?
No, I think to your earlier comment, I mean, when I left the project office and took on other responsibilities, my direct day-to-day interest ended.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Murray. Those are my questions.
Not seeing counsel for Golder or Dufferin turning on their cameras to ask questions, I believe that leaves City of Hamilton to conduct their examination.
Thank you, Mr. Senta. Mr. Murray, I just have a few questions following up on some of the testimony that you've given this morning. First, you had a discussion earlier with Commission Counsel about the city's use of consultants. And I wanted to ask you, when city staff asks for advice from a consultant, do the city staff then rely on the consultant's expertise?
Generally, yes.
But am I right that city staff also sometimes have technical expertise depending on their position?
Yes, that's true.
So is the expectation that staff will rely on their own judgment in conjunction with the advice that's provided by consultants when they're making decisions?
Yes, I think there are going to be instances where their own advice will be taken into consideration in informing, a decision or making known matters, to a standing committee or to council. So, I mean, generally speaking, I mean that's not beyond the realm of possibility.
Okay. And does city staff sometimes have knowledge of additional factors that should be considered that a consultant might not be aware of?
That is possible.
Okay. And would those considerations include things such as resource limitations or prioritization of issues by the city?
I think we're getting into something very generic here. So if you could maybe be more specific, because I think just generic question will yield I don't know if it will be a useful response.
Sure, that's fine. What I was asking you is, are there occasions where a consultant might not be aware of all of the details that city staff would be aware of that would go into city council, for example, making decisions such as resource limitations or how the city is prioritizing certain issues?
Yeah, I mean, all those kinds of other details aren't necessarily going to be germane to what the consultant is being hired to do. But again, I would, through the course of retaining a consultant to give specialist advice, there's usually a sharing of information, and so I think it's whether that has any effect whatsoever on the consultant's work. I guess it really depends on specifics, but there are going to be things that are separate and different from what the consultant's been asked to do for us, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And would you expect that city staff and particularly staff in leadership positions would use their judgment in applying the advice that's contained in a consultant's report?
To a point. It really depends on the nature of the consultant advice.
Okay. I want to ask you now about consultants' reports. And you had a discussion earlier with Commission Council about consultants' reports that are sometimes prepared for the City of Hamilton. And was there a policy about whether city staff were required to provide consultant reports to City Council?
I'm not aware of a specific policy that mandates or requires all consultant reports to be provided to council, no.
Okay, so does that mean it was left up to city staff's judgment as to whether a council would need a copy of a specific consultant's report?
Yes, it certainly could be left up to the staff person's judgment. But again, I think in answering the question that I was asked previously, it's not unreasonable to expect that reference to a consultant's work would be made in such a report that we would be providing a standing committee or council.
Okay, and then this might flow from your previous answer, but was there a policy about whether staff could provide some council members with copies of reports if so requested by some councillors?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that policy.
Okay, and then in your experience, was it unusual to provide a copy of a report to certain councillors if they had if it was particularly relevant to that councillor, for example, because of their ward or their constituency?
Again, I think the reference earlier to was, and I'll just split a hair here, is that draft reports, or for that matter, reports. I think it's there are going to be conversations with members of council in terms of things that affect their wards. The sharing of that kind of information, I don't think I don't recall there ever being such a policy in Hamilton, and I'm not aware of those kinds of policies elsewhere. But and again, maybe I'll just get you to Janine or Ms. Roberts, just rephrase your question again so I can answer it properly.
Okay, I think you've answered my question, but I'll ask sort of a related one now. For reports to council that do discuss a consultant's report, as you mentioned, they often reference a report, but don't actually attach the report. Can City Council then request that staff provide a copy of the report?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, and given such a request from council, staff would then be required to provide a copy, is that right?
That would be my expectation, yes. Okay.
A slightly different topic. You were asked about Mr. Moore's acceptance of a trip to Ottawa for a 2009 Consulting Engineer Awards in recognition of Golder's work on the RHVP. And you told us that if the issue of accepting that trip was raised to you at the time, you would have entertained a different option that could have allowed Mr. Moore to attend the award ceremony. And I wanted to ask you, in your view, what impact, if any, did Mr. Moore's acceptance of that trip have on Mr. Moore's work on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
Yeah, I think Mr. Moore, at the time that I worked with him on the project, had always, as I said earlier, demonstrated, good engineering ability. And as I pointed out, I think he's one of the engineers that, when I look back on all that I've worked with, has been, quite good at his job. And so a gift of that, although I think I've answered the question as to in light of our code of conduct, the acceptance of such a gift not being a great choice, I do not think it would influence his expertise or his recommendations as an engineer. I think he would still give us, his best advice.
Okay, and then just a slightly different question. What impact, if any, did Mr. Moore's acceptance of that trip have specifically on any safety issues with respect to the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
Yeah, I don't see a connection.
Okay. And then another related question, what impact, if any, did you see that Mr. Moore's acceptance of this trip to Ottawa would have had specifically on the disclosure of any friction reports to council or to the public?
Yeah, again, the judgment to accept the gift I've already commented on, but I still think connecting that to, his decisions about a report, the one that's in question here, I think those are two very separate matters.
Okay. And then just one more question about the anonymous letter that Commission Counsel asked you about earlier. And you confirmed that, contrary to the statement that was contained in there, you did not take steps to avoid exposing any flaws on the Red Hill Valley Parkway. Did you have any concern that Mr. Moore took any steps to avoid exposing flaws on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No, I don't believe he took any steps to avoid flaws. And I will just add, the use of the term parkway had more to do with the road's location in a park type area. So it wasn't to avoid a standard or anything of that nature.
Thank you, Mr. Murray, Mr. Commissioner. Those are all my questions.
Nothing further from Commission Counsel.
Okay. Well, and I think we're done. I want to thank Mr. Murray for attending and giving his evidence today. You're excused if you want to sign off, Mr. Murray. And I think we're done for the day. The intention being that the council can and the commissioner certainly can use Fridays to the extent they're available for reviewing the evidence. And I intend to do that. I think that's reflected in our schedule thus far. So unless there's anything else, Mr. Senta, that we have to do today.
No, Commissioner, I think we stand adjourned until Monday morning.
Monday at 9:30?
9:30. And just to remind council, next week we are sitting Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. We will not be sitting Thursday and Friday.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.